This is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you so much for joining us this week. This week, I spoke with Natalie Newell, co-host of the Science Enthusiast podcast and the co-director of the new documentary, Science Moms. The website for her film notes that she holds an MED and worked for a decade in the field of Montessori education before choosing to become a stay-at-home parent and pursue her interests in science and secular activism. The film, quote, dissects the bogus claims of these celebrities one by one and explains in simple language what the science really shows about GMOs, vaccines, homeopathy, and any of these topics that are often in the headlines, yet even more often are understood. Listen to the trailer.
Genetic engineering does not involve syringes with needles. It's just not how it works.
If you put into Google, what is a GMO? The first few Google results are bullshit. They're not science-based, they're not reputable sources. They're going to be websites that are sponsored by the organic industry to scare you about your food.
I can't imagine parents reaching for something that's untested, unregulated, and literally has no active ingredients in it. It just baffles me.
If someone is talking about a synthetic chemical and calling it a toxin, you know they don't know what they're talking about, and then you shouldn't listen to them anymore.
Nature will kill you really quickly.
There's some organizations that are trying to scare people away from buying certain fruits and vegetables. That's crazy to me.
The voices of moms who inform their decisions with fear and hype rather than evidence, those voices are so loud.
I don't understand this mindset that anyone who doesn't have the exact same worldview as you must be paid to have that worldview.
Conspiracy theories, accusations. I've been called a fake mom. I have gotten death threats.
Being a parent is scary. We're all trying to do the best for our kids. There are plants all over the world. They're going to be wiped out. And so there are real world consequences.
We could really change things for the better using this technology.
Science is so cool.
We talked about her upbringing and foray into the world of skepticism, the work she does on the Science Enthusiast, and the impetus and reception of Science Moms. Natalie is an amazing voice for science, reason, and skepticism, and I had a wonderful time speaking with her. So here's my interview with Natalie Newell. Natalie Newell, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm really looking forward to our chat. I reached out to you because I thought you were a perfect person to come on to talk a little bit about skepticism and critical thinking. I've had Guy P. Harrison on before, talking about some issues involving skepticism and how to use critical thinking to improve the way you use social media. And you are the director and producer of a new documentary called Science Moms, which talks a lot about that kind of application of science and critical thinking to parenting or to medicine or to general health. So I'm really looking forward to chatting about that. But before we get into it, I'd just love to hear a little bit about your background. How did you get into skepticism and what inspired you to kind of go down this route?
Okay, so I guess like skeptical origin story. So when I was in undergrad, I was in Connecticut College, and I was a psychology major. And I was fortunate enough to be paired with an amazing college advisor. His name is Stuart Vise, and this all kind of makes sense as to like the path to skepticism, because he's obviously a psychology professor who had a focus in studying like behaviorism and irrational behavior. And he's written for places like Skeptical Inquirer and has spoken at conferences like PsyCon. Like he's one of these guys who, now I look back and I'm like, oh, that's so rad that he was that this is the person, that was my advisor.
Yeah.
in college, I would take any class that Stuart taught pretty much because he was awesome. But it was one particular class that I took my junior year. So this is the spring of 2004. I took a class called Irrational Behavior, which, looking back at it now, I would put like in parentheses in like Introduction to Skepticism, really, like is what this class was. It was the kind of class where I still remember the beginning of just one of the sessions. Stuart handed out papers to everybody saying that it was our horoscope, right? It was based on our astrological sign. We all read these papers that he gave us, and imagine that. It sounded just like each of us, right? And then he asks us to look around at, the papers that other people have, and we all have the same thing. And he kind of showed, stuff that we sort of knew, obviously, but drilled home, like astrologies. Oh, can we swear on this show or no?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I was gonna say just bullshit, because that's just the easiest way to talk about some of this stuff. But it was in this class where he talked about stuff like astrology, talked about other examples of people believing in weird stuff, like back in, I don't know if it was sort of like Victorian times when people did a lot of trying to communicate with the dead and spiritualism and all that kind of stuff. People who used like dowsing rods or whatever those things are called, like, all those crazy sort of pseudoscience-y things that he then tied to things like logical fallacies and all of this that we learned in this class. I clearly stuck with me because then, after graduation, I pursued, as a career, I didn't stick with psychology. I went the education route, and I was a Montessori preschool teacher and then school principal for that. That was about a decade of my life. But all during that time, I started gravitating towards books by people like Carl Sagan. And of course, I read like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Michael Shermer's Why People Believe Weird Things, all that kind of stuff. I'm just reading in my spare time. So I guess I was just always continuing this path that I realized, looking back, that I started in this college classroom in 2004, because it just resonated with me, I guess, this desire to see the world, for what it is, rather than what people are, or just believing what people are telling us,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Just as a quick aside, I love the fact that you bring up that story about astrology in your classroom, because in literally the previous episode, I did a Q&A episode with some of my listeners, and I had a question about astrology, how to deal with astrology, and I used that same example in describing astrology, but instead of it being your professor, I was using it when James Randi did it. Mm-hmm. James Randi did it in a documentary about 25 years ago, where he went into a college classroom and did the exact same thing. And so I always think of that as like a great way of kind of explaining to people how vague and general horoscopes are, and how they often carry with them antithetical statements. So it'll say things like, you're very shy, but when pushed to it, you can be very open and talkative. You're mean, but then you can also be nice when needed. And the thing is that applies to everybody. So I love the fact you brought that example up. I think it's great.
Yeah, so it was just the kind of thing where, you're sitting there, and I mean, when it's like, oh, my mind was blown, but in a sense, it's like, okay, well, these are things that people just believe readily. And yeah, and I guess that was really where the interest started grabbing me. And then, of course, I mean, when I started reading for myself after college, who reads Carl Sagan and isn't captivated by everything he says?
He's amazing. I mean, right? He's as close as we get in this field to having a saint. I mean, and his language is so vivid and so beautiful. I mean, you probably feel exactly the same way, but The Demon Haunted World was a very life-affirming and life-changing book for me. I say it should be required reading for college students as freshmen. I think they should read it, or seniors in high school.
I absolutely agree. I mean, after I did SciCon in Vegas, somebody contacted me who's developing a course at the University of Maryland asking, hey, do you have any advice, if it's sort of a, skepticism, critical thinking course? I said, Demon Haunted World. Like that is the first book that comes to mind that anybody who's, delving into this area of critical thinking and skepticism needs to read, because it's the thing with Carl Sagan. And I could probably geek out about Carl Sagan for a ridiculous amount of time.
Go for it. I have a portrait of him on my wall, so go for it.
But the thing with him, you read his words and he's putting out there, just essentially the factual picture of what this world is, right? But he's doing it in this way where he is obviously captivated by the awe and the beauty of everything, right? So it's just infectious. And he's the kind of person, I think that, I don't believe in God. I've been an atheist for quite a while. But reading Carl Sagan, it's this affirming type of thing where it's I already knew that I didn't believe in anything bigger than me and the world and all of this. But reading the words of somebody who is so in awe of the world around us, it sort of affirms that, we don't need that, because everything this is just so sort of miraculous and beautiful in a way, and I use that word in, not a God sense, but just in the sense of this is just so rad. And Carl Sagan captures it so well. And so he I think he should be required reading, because it's that mix of the science, but also the wonder of how cool the world is.
He was one of those wonderful scholars who had a wonderful ability to meld the sciences with a clear understanding and appreciation of the humanities.
Yes.
So I'm a historian by profession. And I'm a liberal arts background. My degrees are in history, political science, philosophy. I didn't really learn about science until I was in college. I had really horrible science teachers growing up, except for one that in seventh grade that was pretty good. But for example, my high school biology teacher was a creationist. And
no way.
Yeah. And she would deliberately not teach natural selection, the theory of evolution by natural selection, until the end of the semester. So she'd either have to briskly go over it or ignore it altogether, which doesn't make any sense to me, because I always make the point of trying to teach biology without the theory of evolution is like trying to teach English literature without Shakespeare. They're so intertwined. To understand biology is to understand evolution. So I didn't really learn about science and the importance of science until I took my skepticism to another level. Because for me, I like you, I actually discovered skepticism also in 2004, but it was in a completely different way. I was an eighth grader. My dad and I had just moved up north with my grandmother, and my dad and I were at this. There used to be a chain of movie video rental stores called Movie Gallery. Mm-hmm. And they had basically these blowouts because the company was going out of business. You go and buy DVDs. And they had this DVD set. It was called Penn and Teller Bullshit.
Oh, yeah.
And I had never seen it before. And I was like, this looks really cool. And my dad and I thought it was magic stuff. So we bought it. Mm-hmm. And I take it home. And I literally devoured every episode in a weekend. And I used to watch those ad nauseum, and I have all the seasons. And Penn and Teller had an immense impact on me. And through them, I got into James Randi and Michael Shermer. And so if I were to develop a skeptics reading list, I would definitely include Demon Haunted World by Carl Sagan. But I would also include Flim Flam by James Randi.
Yes.
Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science by Martin Gardner. Which is a classic book. And then obviously Shermer's Why People Believe Weird Things. And if you want to go real crazy with it, you can go all the way back to Charles McKay's book. I forget, it's oh, it's like something in the madness of crowds. I forget, but it's like he wrote it in the 1800s, and it's like one of the,
gosh. Oh, so like old school.
Yeah. Charles Mackay wrote this book, and I forget what the full title of it, but the second half of the title is In the Madness of Crowds. And it's basically a book about skepticism that was written in the mid to late 1800s. And he goes through like witchcraft and all kinds of different prestidigitation and all kinds of different things. And so like before all these guys that we talked about, he was writing about it too. And it's a pretty powerful book, but I can't believe I'm blanking on the title there, but through skepticism is how I became an atheist and how I got interested in science. So it's really cool to hear how we sort of came to the same paths, but in slightly different ways. It's really cool.
So you then were using sort of your skeptical toolbox to become an atheist?
Yeah.
I mean, is that like an accurate sort of assessment of how that worked?
Absolutely. So like I grew up non-religious. My parents were non-religious. I didn't go to church as a kid, so religion didn't mean that much to me. But I didn't know atheism was an option. I was like a hardcore skeptic from 8th grade on, and I was constantly like reading about reading people like, I don't know if you've ever read Joe Nickell before.
I haven't, no.
Joe Nickell's super, super cool. And he's like the real life, he's a guy, but he's more like the real life Dana Scully. So like he's like the skeptic, and he's written books about like ghosts and the Shroud of Turin and Bigfoot and exorcisms and stuff like that and aliens, and he's written a lot of great stuff. And I loved reading his books when I was in high school and stuff because I wanted to. So for a time, I got really obsessed with the Da Vinci Code. And I was really obsessed with this notion that Jesus Christ was a real living human being who had a child and had a bloodline. Like that concept was interesting to me in so many ways, because Jesus, you think of as sort of being this untouchable, ethereal character, which turns out he probably kind of was. So I was trying to like read, and so he has these like excellent articles about like debunking the Shroud of Turin and debunking some of the other things, and but yeah, no. And then I think by the time I was like 18 or 19, between senior year of high school and freshman year of college, was when I discovered like the Horsemen. That's when I discovered Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens and stuff like that. And by the time I started college, I was like, I'm an atheist. I know what I am. Yeah. So yeah, I totally applied my skepticism to atheism, because I think my thing was this: if Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and the Chupacabra and ghosts and psychics are fake, God's probably fake too. Yeah. So anyway.
And that's like, that makes a lot of sense. Like it's another story that people tell, and, it's a story that survived a really long time. And yeah, but I think that I'm always interested to find out how people get to whatever, you self-identify as, whether, it's the atheist stuff, the skeptic stuff, all of it or whatever. I mean, for me, the atheism, I still remember the conversation where I think I acknowledged it kind of more hardcore for the first time, was just this casual conversation on a road trip with my friend Ross, driving, I don't know, I think we were driving like from our college up to, see my parents for a weekend, and just having this conversation of, do you believe in God? And then just kind of going along these lines of logic and reasoning and realizing like, yeah, I don't. And I had grown up sort of, I say like kind of Catholic or culturally Catholic, because my family's Italian American. So it was more, I think it was one of those, the Catholicism was tied more to this is what you're sort of supposed to do, as part of the culture, rather than, we didn't really sit at home and say the rosary or something. I don't know what people do, but like, whatever. But it never felt like, I was relying on any divine intervention or power, over my life. And then I guess maybe my acknowledging my own atheism it never felt very like climactic or anything. It was just, oh yeah, that's me. That makes sense that this is what I am, or this is what I don't believe. Like I now am acknowledging that I have answered one of the easier questions in life, that, there's not a sky dad up there watching over me, but
and for me, it was one of the things that was really lovely about it, at least for me, was it was a real sense of freedom. I felt this intense capacity of like, it was like the first time that I really acknowledged on some level that my life belonged to me. That even though I wasn't religious, when you grow up in, like I did in rural Indiana, you grow up with this sense of just the culture all around you is religious, even if you're not. And so you kind of don't care all that much about it to a certain extent, because it wasn't a part of my life. And I didn't really acknowledge how much it had actually influenced my own sort of, I don't know, how do you describe it? Maybe this isn't the best way to describe it, but like sort of like subconscious biases about my life and how I felt about it. But until I acknowledged, like, yeah, I don't believe in God and I don't have these religious beliefs or whatever, it was this real sense of like, oh, wow, like life had this whole new meaning to me. So like I went from being I was a decent but lazy student in high school to being a very motivated student in college. Like I used to read a lot in high school and stuff, but I started to read way more once I got into college. And like by the time I got to like 19, 20, 21, that was really when I realized like, oh man, I can do all these things and I can do this and I can do that. It was really, really special to me. And so it was a real freeing moment and a real like catharsis to like learn it's so much that I didn't know anything about. So I was like, I don't know anything about evolution. I don't know anything about it. So like I read Jerry Coyne, I read Richard Dawkins, I read Daniel Dennett's book about Darwin, and I'm like, I don't know anything about science. I don't know anything about astronomy. I don't know anything about physics. And then it was eventually, who are some people who in the period that I studied, because my area of scholarship and history is the late 19th century in America, and I study the Gilded Age. And that was where I discovered Robert Ingersoll. And my master's thesis about him. He was a late 19th century free thinker orator. He was known as the Great Agnostic, and he gave speeches all across the country. He was the most requested and most popular public speaker in America in the late 1800s, with the exception of Mark Twain.
Oh, wow.
He made upwards of somewhere between $100,000 to $200,000 a year doing public speeches, most of which, and this is like in the 1880s, 1890s.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's pretty major.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Mostly ones that were very, very critical of religion, but thousands of people would show up, even people that didn't agree with him. So it was really this amazing thing where like my atheism gave me kind of a purpose in life. Where I started to learn about the history of free thought, particularly in America. And then I wrote my master's thesis on Robert Ingersoll. So, it's really interesting how, it's interesting for me, letting go of religion, allowed me to embrace my life and do something with it in a way that I never felt before.
But see, and I love you bringing that up, because I think that there's this misconception that if you don't believe in God, then it's like, well, what do you believe in? Do you believe in anything? Whatever. But I think that it really makes you embrace the here and now. Like, this is what we have. We have this brief time on this planet, and it's ours to do with what we can and what we want. And I think that that can be so fucking empowering. It's like, how am I going to make this time the best possible time, not just for myself, but for other people around me? And, it's that, I know it probably sounds like some contrived platitude, but leaving this place better than we found it. Mm-hmm. And how can we, use our time to do that? And I think that there's something about acknowledging that there's not this higher power that has control over our life, and acknowledging that for better or worse. It's like when I fuck up, I have to own that, that was me. The bad shit, it was me, or, sometimes it's other people, but that's life. But then at the same time, you get to own your good too, the good stuff that happens, and you get to thank people for being awesome humans. And you get to acknowledge, it's better or worse, the good and bad in humanity. But I like to think that, people are at their core pretty decent, and it's up to us to be good to each other. And so it gives us a little bit, the responsibility is ours and we have nothing to blame, but that's the life I'd rather live than one where I am constantly either thanking or blaming or forgiving some higher power for being a complete fucking dick, you know?
No, I completely agree. And one of the big things that, my collaborator on my website and my friend Tyler and I were working on is trying to develop a series of essays about different topics where we're trying to explain, okay, let's say you've let go of your belief in God. Now, what matters to you? What's important to you? What are some of the perennial philosophical questions about free will or about ethics or about politics and political responsibility or whatever? And because for me, the thing, I've said this all the time, is that, life must be guided by some kind of philosophy or some kind of value system that you have. It's very easy to say what you're not. It's it's much harder to say what you are. And then I always go back to the classic adage from Alexander Hamilton that, those who stand for nothing fall for anything. And so, just because we're atheists doesn't mean that we're just like these open holes of nihilism, even though sometimes we feel that way. But that we actually do really care, and that there are things that we really do value, and that we're trying to make the world a little bit better. And so that's why I think it's so important to learn about critical thinking and learning about skepticism and science and all those kinds of things. So in reference to science, see my segue there? In reference to science.
Wow, this guy, that's a segue, because I'm all about the good segues on my own show. So
I try my best.
This is fantastic.
I try my best. See, I was hesitant to see if I wanted to make that joke or not, but then I appreciated the fact that, I know that what we're about to talk about might be a little bit of inside baseball, but I always kind of enjoy it. So
I'm into it. Good job.
So you are the co-host of the wildly popular and successful podcast, The Science Enthusiast, with Dan Broadbent. And I would love to hear about how you got involved with the podcast and kind of what your podcast covers for those who maybe have not have heard of it or have never listened to it before.
All right. So Dan and I met because of the magic of the internet, because the internet can be a good place sometimes. Just don't read the comments ever.
Yeah.
So I met Dan online because I had started, which I know we're going to talk about it in a little bit, but I also have a documentary called Science Moms, for which I 2 years ago started a Facebook page, to get social media going as I began production of this film. And Dan and I met in a secret group on Facebook for people who have science pages. And Dan and I just became buddies. It was one of those things where, started messaging and sharing memes with each other and realized we are in a lot of ways, for better or worse, kind of the same person. And we just became fast friends through the social media sphere. It was it was May of 2016, I guess, that we met for the first time in real life at Nexus, the skepticism conference in New York City that they have every year. So we both went to Nexus, and by that point we'd kind of been friendly online for months, and we'd had some Google Hangout chats and conversations where we knew we were able to have interesting talks, or we found them interesting or entertaining or whatever. And then it was at Nexus, though, after a weekend of hanging out and listening to talks by amazing people, we thought, let's just give a podcast a try, because maybe there are people out there that want to listen to some of the conversations that we're having. And so within days of coming back from that conference, we started the Science Enthusiast podcast. And so for anybody who doesn't know, Dan has run for, it's probably getting close, it's probably about 3 years or so now. He runs the Science Enthusiast page on Facebook, which has over 800,000 people following it. So Dan knows how to social media very well. And so we decided to do the podcast as sort of an offshoot of that page. And Dan's page has always covered kind of scientific skepticism stuff, but also during the time that I knew him, or started to know him, he started branching out more into atheist type of content. We're definitely more liberal leaning politically, so that's out there. But we started this podcast. The first couple episodes, if you go back and listen, we're kind of drunk. We just kind of did, because who knows when you start these things, right? Like, who knows what it's going to be? Who knows if people are going to listen? It was us just kind of dicking around, honestly. Like, but still having conversations where, like, I look back and they're funny, but we're also kind of, we're talking about things. Like, we talked about March Against Monsanto in the first episode, and we talked about naturopathy in the second episode. And so we were already, kind of getting into interesting content, but we weren't sure, is this a thing that we are really going to do? And it's a thing we are really doing, and we're now up to like 72 episodes, and it evolved from, the first episode of just this sort of drunken Google hangout that we released the audio of, to we have pretty much almost every week we have an awesome guest. There are some episodes that are just the two of us talking, which I have to say, some of those episodes that are just me and Dan are some of the ones that I kind of hold closer to my heart, because it's, when it's just you, like, putting yourself out there, there's something both freeing and frightening about doing that, like getting a little more personal. But we cover topics related to science and skepticism and atheism, and how all of these things, are impacted or impact things like government. Because the Trump era, I think, changed the direction maybe slightly of the podcast, because a year ago, after the election, I think we realized, we're going to be talking about politics more than I think we anticipated. Because, if we're a science show, or if we have an atheist leaning, or whatever we are, because, we're all these things. And what's nice is that we've allowed ourselves to just be ourselves on the show. And the content that we put out is just, we're not boxing ourselves in, I guess is what I'm saying. But we did realize that in sort of this current climate in the US, if we're talking about science, we probably are also going to be talking about politics. If we're talking about religion, we're going to be talking about that too, because, we've got some issues in the world.
You are certainly understating the case there, but
I'm just understating the raging dumpster fire that we are still living in. I posted today on my Facebook page what came up in my memories from last year on this day. On this day last year, there was a meme that was a dumpster fire ornament that was like, this is 2016. And I, naive Natalie of a year ago, was maybe 2017 will be like a phoenix rising from the ashes of the dumpster fire. And me today, it's like, who are you? Like, who were you a year ago, you optimistic? Like,
so I'm not going to lie. So I saw your post about that. And when I read the original caption on it, I thought that you were so ahead of the curve that you were actually being sarcastic. I didn't realize you were.
I think, okay, I guess it's probably twofold, because did I really, really believe it? Probably not, but I wanted to believe it. Didn't you want to believe it?
Yeah, I think the thing I wanted to have happen was I wanted that. And this is kind of, I think, the silver lining of the election, because I've spent the last year or so trying to make sense of all this craziness. I mean, my podcast, it's called Reason Revolution, but it could have easily have been called An Atheist in Indiana Tries to Understand Trumpism. Because I spent a good portion of the early episodes of the show, because the format of my show has changed a lot. So like when I first launched this show back in June, it was more of a news commentary show. I sort of pitched it to people as like the Rachel Maddow show, but for atheists. So I would do like news pieces, I would do commentaries, and she does like those long form pieces. I would do a long form piece, but mine would be at the end. But then I got more into the movement and I got more and more guests. And so it's sort of changed over time. But yeah, no, I totally understand. But what I was going to say is I think one of the silver linings of this whole crazy, like fucking bizarro world that we live in right now is the fact that my hope is that people who advocate for science and reason and critical thinking and sort of just liberal democracy in the broadest possible sense, because the one thing I'm very worried about, I think almost worried about more than anything else, is this sort of retreat of liberal democracy around the world and this sort of growth of authoritarianism. And it doesn't matter what wing of authoritarianism it's on, but just authoritarianism in general. And that really worries me, because anytime you have a society that becomes more and more authoritarian is a real loss of freedom. When you have a real loss of freedom, you have a real loss of the ability to do science and to do critical thinking and to do what a society needs to do to get better. And so, that's one of the things I've tried very hard to try to understand with this whole thing, is that my hope is that this will galvanize people. And the other thing is that my hope is that it also will galvanize the Democratic Party to start giving a shit about local elections again, which fortunately for us, it looks like they kind of have.
Yeah.
So
I know that was like a hopeful moment, wasn't it? To see that people went and voted and those votes yielded results.
Oh, totally. And it was like these beautiful moments where not only did the Virginia assemblyman who wrote the trans bill, did he lose his election, but he lost his election to an openly transgender woman. Like, that's very cool. Like, that's so cool to me. That secular candidates around the country in local elections were also elected too, which I think is so great. So, I mean, I think we do have to keep an eye on this. And my show has been, I am extremely political, and I've always been political, and this is my third podcast that I've done over the last year. So I did a couple other ones before, but this is the one I'm doing now. And they've always been about politics. I think, to me, life is political. And for the people who are like, I don't care about politics, but no, you're an adult. You need to start caring about politics. You need to start caring about the people who run your country or who attempt to run our country.
Well, yeah. And I think that absolutely. And even further, it's just, you need to start caring, like, full stop there. Like, this, again, we can't just complain. Yes, there's parts of the world that it's just shit. Like, and yes, Trump got elected. There's a lot that is fucking awful, but we have to do something with that. And so if it's the fire under everybody's ass to keep, like, fighting for reason and critical thinking and logic and having the right people in the right positions out there in the world, like, it's on us to help make that happen. So with things, like, we need to have these conversations and keep having these conversations. And as far as, science goes, I was stoked when, people moved and made the March for Science in the spring, like, just to have people out there saying, we don't want to just be quiet and let, some, conservative backwards culture of ignorance take over.
Totally.
No. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the March for Science was wonderful. And I was at the Indianapolis part of that, where I live here, and the local director of our local Center for Inquiry spoke there, and she and I are good friends, and we had a table out there for CFI and everything, and that was really great. So no, I totally agree with you. I think the thing that I think about a lot too, and I guess maybe this is the other reason why I'm cautiously optimistic, is that what we're seeing right now, I think, in this country with sort of the ascendancy of some of the evangelical Christian right in the Trump administration and in our government right now, is it feels and it appears to be like a last gasp of power before they know that, like, the demographics and the way the country's going, that they're going to lose power at some point. That there was a recent poll that just came out that nearly a third of Americans identify as, unchurched or religiously unaffiliated. So that hovers somewhere between like 20 and 30%. And that's a number that's growing all the time. That more and more people are not, so either if they're not explicitly atheist, they're not so damned theocratic and religious. And so the thing that I think is important is that there's a huge gap between the people who identify as that and then the people who identify as that and vote. And so I think the thing is to try to lower that gap. That's what I think is super important. and to really expose one of the bigger problems that I think is racking our country now with Trump. And one thing I think you've hit on really, really well with your new documentary, Science Moms, is the problem of celebrity, and that and how celebrity plays into how we view things as a public. So your documentary has just come out, Science Moms. And you have a few really great people in there, all moms of their own. One's a neuroscientist, one's a plant geneticist, a molecular geneticist, a couple are science communicators. So what was the impetus from Science Moms, and kind of how did you get that started?
All right. So again, I just want to compliment the segue. You're killing it. And like, I'm going to learn from you as I move forward in my shows. Like, fucking fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, just I had to call that out. So Science Moms. All right. So origin of Science Moms is that obviously, like you said, we live in this culture that is just drenched in celebrity bullshit, the woo and pseudoscience that's invaded everywhere, but particularly parenting. So I'm a parent also. I have two little boys. One is almost 3. That's little Zeke. And Milo is 4.5. So when Zeke was a baby, because I was up during the night feeding him as you do. And you know, I wasn't totally paying attention to everything I was doing at 2 a.m. because I was scrolling on my phone. I will admit that I would like feed him and like, oh, let's check the internet. And I never have gravitated much towards, you know, quote unquote mommy blogs or parenting sites or whatever. I'm lucky in that with my children, I've never felt a lot of fear. I'm lucky to have a mom of my own who she's a former nurse. She is one of the most like level-headed, amazing, reasonable people I know. Just like that's her nature. She doesn't freak out about stuff. I feel fortunate to have had her as a mom. So I'll just put that out there. Like I think I started all of this from my baseline. It is just, I'm not super scared of the world. And I feel really fortunate for that because I think that there's a lot of nurture aspects of that from my life that allowed me to enter motherhood without a lot of fear. But what's weird about that, and sorry, I'm going to get to the movie, but
no, you're fine. This is great.
But it's weird sometimes to kind of look around and realize like a lot of other people are scared of a lot of stuff. Like here I was, you know, I had a baby and Milo at that point was like 2 years old. And I live outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland. So I live in the suburbs and, you know, middle class, like where people like the problems around here are a lot of first world problems kind of thing. So at that point I was working I was a school principal, and the concerns that would be brought to me were things like, you know, do you think that the school should only serve organic food because blah, 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 whatever? Or when, this is one of the crazy ones. You know, people would say to me, oh, you know, now you have kids of your own. You better really think about if you want to do all those vaccines on time. Oh, God. Or you ready for like, this is the one that I can't even, with it. When Milo was a baby, he was, I guess, maybe slightly colicky. I don't know. He just like fucking fussy because he was a baby and life's hard when you're little and can't communicate. So he'd cry, you know, and there was a mom that saw him crying and I'm with him, whatever. And she goes, you know, you might want to take him to a chiropractor. Oh God. Right? Yeah. That's the only response. That's the only correct response. And here I was, I'm the head of the school, so I can't give my real reaction to essentially my client, you know, who's a parent. And so I was just like, okay, I have to go. And I probably didn't have to go, but in that moment, flight was the only option. Yeah. But so this is the background of the world that I was living in, right? Where I was just eventually starting to wonder, maybe, like, am I wrong in not being scared of this stuff? Or am I wrong in just trusting the fact that I have these rad pediatricians that are like taking great care of my kids and vaccinating them on time and all this stuff? Like, am I missing something, basically? And so as I'm scrolling through the internet this one night, I went on to the one like parenting-ish blog that I always kind of liked. It's called Grounded Parents. And I come across this post, which was essentially this open letter written by a group of scientist and science communicator moms. And they, like, the hashtag that went along with it was Moms for GMOs. It was an open letter to people like Gwyneth Paltrow and Sarah Michelle Gellar and those celebrities who are on that kick of like, just label it as far as GMOs. Like, when Gwyneth Paltrow had the privilege of going to fucking Washington, D.C. and standing in front of lawmakers and saying, I'm here as a mom, blah, 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 just label it. So this group of women, these, who I now consider some of my closest friends, this group of intelligent, badass, like amazing women, wrote this letter, essentially saying to these celebrities, we're moms too. Don't co-opt the idea of motherhood with your, with their agenda, which is based not in science and evidence, because the consensus on GMOs is that they're safe to consume. Like, that's the scientific consensus. Yet, if you just ask people, like out on the street, they're probably going to agree with what Gwyneth Paltrow has said.
Yeah.
Because celebrity culture. It's
celebrity culture, and that there's also this, I mean, as you well know, it's people who don't understand the naturalistic fallacy. It's people who buy into this idea that if you call something like organic or natural, or the one thing that we kind of bonded over on Facebook, which is I fucking hate the goddamn Panera ads. They piss me the fuck.
Clean eating.
Every time that lady on that ad says clean, I literally want to like scream. Like, it makes me so angry. Because my first question is, what the fuck does that mean?
I know. It's like,
what, did you wipe your ass with my sandwich before I ate it? Like, I mean, what is it?
What's the alternative? Sorry. You either get the food with the dirt or the food without, or the person washed their hands or not. It makes no fucking sense, but it sounds so sanctimonious.
Oh, it's totally sanctimonious.
And that's what it is. And so here's this world that we live in, this clean eating, organic, non-GMO, gluten-free even when you don't have celiac disease. Like, all of this stuff is everywhere. And so for me, then I see a group of intelligent moms coming together and saying, like, we are presenting a different narrative. And so for me, in that moment, I've been asked this question, kind of, how did it start? And I feel almost like it was that moment, and then here I am. And yet there's 2 years in between.
Yeah.
But you just have an idea, and this for me, I think, was maybe I've done, I had this whole career in education. I've done a lot of stuff, but for me, this film was it's like my baby, my third baby. That was like this thing that was an idea that I felt like had to happen, because it was the combination of so many things for me. It was my own feelings as a parent, plus my, this whole background in just being interested in critical thinking and skepticism and all of that. And it married all of these things together, and just wanting to tell a story. And I think sometimes with science, we talked about Carl Sagan before. Carl Sagan is an outlier, I think, in science and communication.
Totally.
Because he had the science, and he is one of the most compelling, amazing communicators, I think, of all time. But I think, unfortunately, somewhere along the way, you know, science has always had the facts, but it hasn't always had the feels, you know, and for things like vaccines and GMOs, who's presenting these positive anecdotes and the feels for those things? Well, it's not the people with science. It's, you know, Andrew Wakefield's exploiting people who have autism and saying vaccines cause autism. And Jesus Christ, that's a compelling and terrible story, you know?
Totally.
The anti-GMO activists are talking about how organic, non-GMO diets can cure their children of whatever, you know, cornucopia of illnesses they want to make up. These people are pulling on heartstrings. And who needs facts when you have your stories that make people feel good and whatever? And so, you know, I thought maybe do something where we're kind of marrying together the science and the fact that there are humans who are approachable and relatable and funny communicating the facts. So, you know, this awesome group of moms.
I absolutely love that about your documentary. It was something you constantly went back to in the discussion, was this idea that, you know, that we are human beings. I believe it was Alison Bernstein said this point as a part of it. She goes, you know, yeah, I'm a scientist, but like I like to play tennis. Yeah. And I like to cook, and I like to do this, and and she's like, I'm a human being, like I do things, I'm just like you. I just so happen to do science for a living, and like I thought it was really lovely, because one of the problems I do, and you've nailed it, is that science does have sort of a message problem with the public, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that sometimes, let's just be honest, sometimes scientists don't want to message with the public. You know, yeah. Carl Sagan, yes, he's beloved, but he got a tremendous amount of criticism from the scientific community for what he did. And in fact, it's probably what held back his admittance to the National Academy of the Sciences, which they didn't even admit him. They gave him like an honorary award. And it was like 2 years after he died, but they never actually let him in. And it was for that reason, because they didn't think he was a real scientist, even though he had done groundbreaking research on the greenhouse effect on Venus and had peer-published articles, and people had cited him in other work. And he had worked on the Viking project and the Voyager project. It's not like he was totally a real scientist, but somehow, because he talked to the unwashed masses, that somehow that was a problem. And fortunately, I think science has changed a lot since those days, but some of it hasn't. And I mean, trust me, in my field of history, it's almost worse, because it's like a cadre of historians who just write for academia. They will write they'll write a thing, and 12 people will read it, one of them which is their mother, and no one will actually look at it, and it becomes this sort of what I call an intellectual circle jerk.
Like some ivory tower syndrome, where it all just gets all stuck up there too, and
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that's part of why I think it's so great that you've put this documentary together with this amazing group of women, this amazing group of moms who've made a point of like, yeah, we're really badass scientists, and we know the facts, and we've got the data. We can show you that, vaccines are totally safe, and GMOs are fine, and homeopathy is complete bullshit. And so I think it's really great that you've put together something that is very informative, but also very accessible, which I think is quite nice. And it doesn't fall too privy to trying to give you every little fact possible or get too much in the jargon. So I think you've really put together something that's very, very palatable for the public, which I think is great.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's the goal, is to start a conversation. I'm not going into this thinking that this film or anything that I do or the women in the film do is going to change the mind of, say, a hardcore, almost religious anti-vaxxer or anti-GMO person, right? Like that's not the goal, because whatever. But I think if a conversation can get started, or it plants the seeds of critical thinking in those people who are kind of the more movable middle, who aren't totally sure and aren't totally sold on either end of the spectrum, that maybe they see this and just start thinking about things a little bit differently, because the messaging is coming from people who they can relate to. And I think that it's not just these topics. It's anything in life where we want to help kind of change hearts and minds or whatever. It's about building bridges and finding connections. And it's not just about going and talking down to people and just like throwing evidence in their face and just being like, I just scienced the hell out of you. No, it's how are we both people first, and what's our common ground? So the film, people can watch that and say, oh, let's start with the common ground of we have parents and we just want to be like, not even because I don't even preach being the best parent ever. Honestly, let's all try to be the most okay parents that we can be while taking care of ourselves at the same time.
Exactly. And I appreciate that, because, and it really was very enlightening for me because I don't have kids and I don't know what it's like to be a parent. I have nieces and nephews. My sister has kids, but I don't. So oftentimes children and parenting is literally it's like a foreign language to me. So I really appreciate having something to watch where I get it. There's a certain level of trepidation and constant fear. And there's probably a part of you that no matter what you do or how calm you may be is probably going to be scared shitless about something in terms of your kid or whatever. But the beauty of what I think you've put together here is that with this amazing group of women is this idea that it's okay to not necessarily know the best answer, but what you should do is go out and try to seek the information that you need. That's reputable, that's peer reviewed, that, listen to your doctor and make the best decisions that you can. And I think that's, really appreciative. I guess as a follow-up question, one of the things I think a lot about and just in general is that, in our country right now, one of the big problems I think we have, and it may be something that's even a global problem, but it's especially a problem in this country, is that there's a real lack of trust in our institutions and in our political institutions, our social institutions, our economic institutions. And scientists in the medical community sadly fall into this as well. So, there's that scene in Science Moms where you guys went to as a counter protest to the march against Monsanto or whatever. And they were like, who's paying you off? Or is Monsanto paying you off or whatever? And it's like, well, I have my truth and this and that and the other. And it just seems to me that a lot of times what people are really angry about isn't like the actual scientific part of it, like if GMOs are safe or not. What the real argument and what they're really angry about is a huge multinational corporation having an incredible amount of political power. That's what they're really mad about. But they won't say that outright because it's not a sexy way to sell it to people. So they say it as a way of, they use the GMO thing as like the back door to talk about how awful Monsanto is. Yeah. And it's fine. Like, it's okay to criticize corporations. It's totally okay to criticize capitalism, but just do that. Like, don't use this sort of charade of GMOs are harmful and I'm just here to protect the kids. Don't use that as a charade to like parade around what you're really trying to say. And again, it just goes back to lack of institutions. So that's like my C-SPAN caller way of trying to get to this question. So, I love that you brought that up. And I'm just going to give like a quick plug for one other conversation I had just like about this topic. Sure. I was on Opening Arguments with Andrew Torres recently, and we did kind of a deep dive into GMO labeling laws and all this corporate-y stuff too. So if people are interested in that, like that's a good other place to go to talk about or to listen to the more corporate conversation. But the bottom line, you're so right on in that people are conflating the idea of biotechnology with corporations. And it's a big fucking bummer for biotechnology. Yes.
Because, and this is where, I think a lot of my passion for biotechnology comes from what it can actually do for the world as a tool. biotechnology is not Monsanto. Biotechnology is a tool. And when people are raging against Monsanto and raging against corporations, they're not thinking about the fact that biotech, genetic modification, whatever, can do things like, save a certain kind of banana crop in Uganda, or the fact that biotech saved the papaya in Hawaii, or biotechnology is golden rice, which helps people in the developing world who are suffering from vitamin A deficiency. And this is where I feel kind of angry sometimes, because it's do you understand when we are here in our comfortable first world where we get to go to the grocery store and choose between seemingly endless options and labels and all of this stuff because we have that privilege, that there are people who are literally starving and suffering in other places that can be helped by this technology, and you are here just saying that Monsanto's evil. It's that's when sometimes that's when I just want to tell people to go fuck themselves. Honestly.
No, I agree.
And that for me is where, yeah.
No, I totally agree. It's one of the bigger problems that I have, because one of my heroes is Norman Borlaug. And Norman Borlaug was the man. I mean, when he won the Nobel Prize in, I think, either 1600 or 1970 for development of the wheat fields that he had developed, and of course golden rice, it had been estimated by just even that point that his technology, his biotechnology, had saved the lives of 1 billion people. And that's, to me, the way that, because one of the biggest, if not the biggest challenges we're going to face as a species on this planet is climate change. And it's going to change the way that our crop yields are going to be. It's going to change water patterns. It's going to change topsoil erosion. It's going to change all of those things. In fact, wineries are even buying land in even some parts of Northern California and Oregon to offset climate change, because they know that the grapes will not grow the same way in Napa Valley 20, 30, 40 years from now. So we need biotechnology. We need, GMO technologies in order to create crops that are more pest resistant, that don't require as much water, that don't require as much land, that don't require as much labor. Because if we do that, we can literally we can get close to curing world hunger. And that's that, and the fact that organizations have gone to countries in Africa and say, don't use GMOs, and that people starved as a result of that, pisses me the fuck off. It makes me angry, because this is not science's fault. This is a political problem, because people politicized it in a way that harmed people. And that's the thing, is it's you're right. I think a lot of this organic and non-GMO bullshit is all about people who want to have a sense. It's literally like a sin tax from the Middle Ages, where the Catholic Church would sell indulgences and would wash you of your sins for a fee. And that's kind of what this shit feels like. That people who buy non-GMO or organic bullshit, the reason they're buying it is because they want to have a sense of moral superiority. They're not really buying it because they may actually think it's better for them, but in the long run, I think a lot of people do it because they live in such a position of privilege that they can do that, and it makes them feel better, even though if it's not actually doing them any better.
Oh my God, you just spoke my mind. and I really, I have to say, I get super stoked when I hear that other people get it too, because, and I think that it goes back to why I made the film. Because what this film has brought me, and this is where I feel slightly sentimental, is 2 years ago, I don't think I knew who my people were. I think part of human nature is the desire to, you want to know all different kinds of people because, that makes life rich and interesting or whatever. But another big part of human nature, I think, is to find your tribe, and to find people that get it, whatever it might be for you, but it's that thing that you know that you can send somebody a message or have a conversation, or you see somebody and you're just connected, right? So I think there's a lot of, mixed feelings people probably have about the skeptic community or various communities or whatever, but like just listening to you talk passionately about this stuff, or when I interviewed the women from my film, or when I met Dan for the first time, or just all of these people that I have the privilege of sort of having in my orbit and in my world, like they all came from skepticism, from this film, from this idea of looking for critical thinking and rational thought in the world. And sorry, I have gone down the sentimental rabbit hole, but for real, it is such an awesome experience. And I hope that the film can contribute to that for other people who might be, another suburban mom who's listening to people have conversations about non-GMO stuff and, oh, please don't feed my child like the conventional produce, or because this really happens. Like I'm not making it up. This really happens. And I want people to know that they have their people out there,
That's wonderful.
So,
that's really wonderful. And you've really, I think, created a wonderful film that has, as I really do think, has been able to do a lot of that for you. It's certainly one of those wonderful tools that will be great discussion pieces. I know one thing that you've done, because I've kind of followed you on Facebook and stuff, is that you guys do screenings of the film, and then you guys do like Q&As afterwards, and and you and your friend, is her name Kevin or Kevin or
Coven?
Okay. My apologies. You guys are like the dynamic duo. You guys are always like the buds. Like I always see you guys like, that's my girl right there taking care of business. I was like, it's so cool.
She is my girl taking care of business. Oh man, I love that. and you know that as soon as I'm done talking to you, I'm gonna text her with that. Like, you're my girl taking care of business.
I love it. I mean, seriously though, like there's a real passion there and a real joy with sharing the material you guys have put together. So it's just been a real pleasure. I wanted to ask you one thing. It just reminded me, because you were talking about fighting with anti-GMO people. I noticed you posted a photo either a day or so ago or whatever about someone who wrote a book, and I think like basically implied you were a shill or something like that.
Oh yeah. The shill accusations have been flying this week, and I will disclose here right now, as I have in other places, Monsanto does not deliver briefcases of money to my house. As much like I wish. And,
oh yeah.
And so no, I'm not a shill for any big anything. But my goodness, I've said this over and over. Hey, if some big company gave me money to make a film, like I just would have said it. People find it so hard to believe that I just wanted to do this thing, and that the idea was mine. And and so this woman, Carrie Gillum, I think that's how you say her name. I don't know, but she's part of the U.S. Right to Know, which is an anti-GMO group. So she wrote this book about Monsanto and glyphosate and whatever. And so, holy shit, in the book, she mentions Science Moms and Moms for GMOs, which was the the open letter that the women wrote. She's essentially saying that we were thought of by Monsanto, which, so you realize I have fake news about me. I am so 2017. I am I'm peak 2017 at this point, because there's literal fake news about me. And I tried to engage with this woman on Twitter yesterday, and just whatever. I think my tone was fine. My tone was fine for Twitter. I'm probably one of the nicer people in just sort of a snarky, absurdist way, but whatever. We emailed her a copy of the film today, Coven was the one who sent the email, and she wrote back immediately. She couldn't respond to any tweets yesterday, this Carrie woman, but she was able to, like, in a nanosecond, respond to Coven saying something about that Coven and I should behave professionally on Twitter. And my response on Twitter was that no, basically. But I think I used way more characters than that. But honestly, these people are, God.
But it goes back to, Shermer writes about this in his book, The Believing Brain, about this idea of patternicity. Human beings, we are hardwired by natural selection to create patterns. And we're really good at it. And we're also really good at making patterns where when there isn't anything there. And conspiracy theories and sort of conspiratorial thinking is a component to that. One other thing I just wanted to say, which is if Monsanto had come up with Science Moms as a tool to be able to get people to be psyched about GMOs, that would mean that their PR department and their ad department is that good. And if that was the case, people wouldn't hate Monsanto.
Right. I mean, so none of it makes sense. But here's what's funny is that as we're having this conversation, I get a Twitter notification from the Twitter account Non-GMO Report, who has 28,000 people following them. And so their response to all of this is, Carrie Gillam has been an excellent high-level journalist for many years, and as such, she wouldn't publish anything that wasn't accurate.
Oh, really?
So
wow.
To that, I say, what do I say? Like, I'm wrong. I'm wrong because she somehow, it's like she gets the sanctity symbol because she represents organic, natural, non-GMO. And I'm over here like repping Frankenfoods, basically. so I am a shill for big Frankenfood, and so that's it. But I want to continue to just find it funny. You know?
Yeah.
Like that's what I'm trying with it because I will admit, like, it pisses me off because I think it pisses anybody off to be essentially called a liar over and over.
Totally.
But it's kind of fucking funny that they care this much about a 28-minute documentary that was kickstarted. And like, it's like, dude, where, like, somebody needs to show me this money because like I've been wearing the same Converse sneakers for 3 years. So like,
exactly.
That's my life. But no, it's all funny. And I would not trade anything right now because this has just been a super rad experience, all of it, all together. So
well, that's wonderful. Thanks for taking a couple extra minutes to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. This has been so fun.
It has been a real blast. Let my audience know where they can contact you and how they can get the film.
Okay, so you can find Science Moms on Facebook. Just search for Science Moms. I have another page called Skeptical Parenting. I'm on Twitter at NC Newell. And lately I've just been fighting with anti-GMO people, but it's funny. So whatever. You can come to Twitter for that. And sometimes I post memes. But that if you want anything related to Science Moms, it is sciencemomsdoc.com, and that has links for, there's a blog, there's ways to download the film right from there, contact info if you want to schedule a screening, and then the Science Enthusiast podcast, you can find us on Facebook or on Blog Talk Radio and I guess other places that you listen to podcasts. So yeah, I'm in all of those places. So
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
And thanks again for sitting down and chatting with me. It's been a wonderful time, and I look forward to chatting with you in the future. And honestly, congratulations on the film, and I wish you continued success with screenings.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that was my conversation with Natalie Newell. To download the film, the link will be in the description box. That's it for this episode of Reason Revolution. Please subscribe to us on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. If there's a platform you listen to podcasts on that I'm not on, please let me know, and I'll try to make it happen. Send us your feedback at reasonrevolutionpodcast@gmail.com. Also follow our Facebook page at facebook.com/reasonrevolution. You can also visit our brand new website, reasonrevolution.org, to keep up on all episodes, blogs, and additional content. You can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. Until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.